Dr. Andrew Weaver is a climate scientist, a member of the faculty at the University of Victoria, and also a member of the Nobel Prize winning Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In 2013, his life took a remarkable turn when he became the first Green Party member of the legislature of British Columbia, the first Green Party MLA in any provincial legislature in Canada, as a matter of fact. We talked at his office here in the legislature about science, about climate, and about the issues and urgencies that led him to abandon the comfortable life of a professor for the hurly-burly of provincial politics.
In science, what you do is you start off with a question or a phenomenon that you try to explain, and you observe that phenomenon and you develop an explanation of all known observations of that phenomenon, a theory in some sense. But in some areas you typically find, and in some of this kind of skeptic arguments of climate science, is you have a solution, and that solution is that global warming is not happening or greenhouse gases are not causing. And instead of seeking a theory that explains all known observations of a particular phenomenon, you have the theory and you seek those observations which support your theory and ignore everything else. I like to think of that as decision-based evidence making as opposed to evidence-based decision making, which is you'd want to build policy from a foundation of evidence, all evidence, not just selective evidence. You don't want to have a decision and then after the fact seek information or evidence to justify it. So in some sense, I would argue that the scientific method is being kind of abused in this global warming skepticism approach.
But there is, within the method itself, there is an element of uncertainty. Because you don't feel as a scientist you're ever in a position to say this climate change thing is happening for these reasons, right? There's always a little element of uncertainty, and that's what the gap they seem to walk through.
Right. There's no such thing as proof in any field of science. Proof only exists in mathematics and logic. In science, you develop an explanation of all known observations of a particular phenomenon. For example, gravity, explains things well, but we have Newton's laws explains things well. But if we start to go at the speed of light, Newton's laws break down because you have to, recognize that you're in a different situation. So there is uncertainty always in science. Every aspect of science, by its very definition, has uncertainty. And I'll give you an example of where uncertainty shouldn't limit decision making. The theory of turbulence is something that is highly uncertain. And in fact, its behavior is chaotic as well. But we can get a good sense of some of the bulk properties of turbulence, which are then used in the design of aircraft. We get into aircraft all the time, despite the fact that there's uncertainty in the theory of turbulence that is used, in the air chambers and in the numerical models to actually design these things.
And you make the point, I think, that you would much rather get into an airplane where there was a 90% probability that the thing would fly.
Yeah. So, but even then, look, in climate science, where the latest stuff is that we're virtually certain, 95% that it's because of humans. Would you, this is a 95% chance that we're right, and that's pretty strong in science, right? So, would you and the consequences are big. Would you kind of ignore a 95% chance of a plane crashing? Probably not. You'd probably say, what, this is a problem. I better, not get on this plane if it's a 95% chance of it crashing, right? So.
Yeah, and it's that very fact that there is a question at all seems to be what they sort of capitalize on.
Right, and so what happens if you follow the history, I've been in this business of climate science since late 1989, I guess, was when I really started. My PhD was in 87, and it was shortly thereafter I got into climate science. If you look at the arguments that have been put forward by the so-called skeptics, it's a little bit about decision-based evidence making. The arguments continually change. But the thesis hasn't. Humans are not causing global warming and it's not a big deal anyway. We had a whole lot of emphasis put on so-called satellite measurements, which apparently didn't show warming. Well, it turned out not to be the case. We've had a whole bunch of stuff on sunspots. Well, it turns out that the sun is cooling. We've had a whole bunch of stuff on natural variability. We've had a whole bunch of stuff on a variety of issues. And it's like the approach is almost as if it's a legal defense team that knows that it has lost its case. But what really matters, you may be guilty, but what matters is you have a jury there, and you want to leave an element of doubt with that jury so that they render a not guilty verdict. And it's the same with climate science. By leaving this element of doubt, the public jury will still, render a not guilty verdict on terms of our causing of global warming.
And another thing that seems to be, I guess one of the things that puzzles me is if you've got 95% certainty that this is happening and the consequences could be catastrophic, how come we seem to be in this sort of stasis condition?
I don't understand it. I mean, it's all about risk versus reward. And the insurance industry, and in particular the reinsurance industry, who are in the business of putting a dollar value to risk and reward, are quite vocal about the desire and need to address this issue. I don't understand it. So, well, I do in some sense, because the damages are future, but the problem is today. So the argument is deferred damages versus dealing with it today. So a lot of people aren't willing a lot of vested interests aren't willing to, change the energy systems that we currently rely upon in order to position ourselves for reduced damages in the next generation.
And there's also the difficulty that you don't see in front of you. It may be the biggest crisis that humanity has ever faced, probably is, but you don't see the evidence of it in front of you? There's a sort of a lag factor here?
Yeah, I mean, the problem here is when I've given talks to the public on global warming, I point out, I show some figures of climate projections, and I show how in the next couple of decades it's really difficult to discern any difference in the projected change that we're in store for, regardless of the policy decisions made today. However, as you move 50, 60, 70, 80 years from now, you get a very, very profound difference in the projected changes. And that boils the whole issue of global warming down to one question, and it's a question of intergenerational equity. Do we, the present generation, owe anything to future generations in terms of the quality of the environment, the quality of the economic systems in place, etc.? Some might argue we don't. You might imagine that there might be some people who believe that we should live today and now and not worry about the future, and that's a legitimate argument. But there are probably others who believe we do, and I happen to be one of them. And where it becomes complicated then is because the people who are making the decisions today actually don't have to live the consequences of those decisions in the next generation, because their either political career is finished, or they're no longer on this earth. So it's therein lies the political problem in dealing with this, is that everybody's seeking quick fix to problems, and then at the next election pointing to the solution that you might have brought to the forefront and pointing out that how you listen to the voters. Let's take an example, a very specific example from the Victoria region. We know in British Columbia, we know in Canada, that over the age of 65, something between 70 and 80% of people vote. We know that people under the age of 21, something like 30 to 40% vote. So there's a different different amount of people voting, but you might imagine that these different demographics have different priorities. For example, as somebody who's broken the 50 mark 2 years ago, my knee's in a lot of trouble, and the reduction of knee replacement lineups or hip replacement lineups might be kind of an important issue for me. And so when I hear a politician talking about healthcare and reducing the lineups for hip replacements and knee replacements, I might be kind of interested in that as a big issue. But that issue is very far away from most people under the ages of 18 to 21. As we get older, we want more certainty. We're not really wanting to take as many risks as we used to. We like certainty, which is why in our political systems, you typically find people become a little more, I guess the word conservative, not necessarily in a political party sense, but in terms of the way they operate their life sense as they get older. Whereas when you're young, your whole life is before you. Everything about that is uncertain. And so you're ready and willing to take on uncertainty in terms of future energy systems, et cetera, because you don't know if you're going to get married. You don't know if you're going to have a job. You don't know where you'll live. You don't know how many children you'll have. And so you live uncertainty in every part of the day, but this generation is not voting. So we end up having the political decision makers, catering to those, as they, rightly should, who elect them, and maybe the issues are not front and center for that demographic who elect the people than those who aren't showing up at the polls.
Yeah. But the ones who are not showing up at the polls are the ones who are most likely to suffer from this.
Absolutely. That youth of today are the adults of tomorrow, and they're the ones not voting today, but they'll live the consequences of the lack of decisions today, tomorrow.
Which sort of suggests how one might attack this, which would be with a campaign that was directed very strongly at the youth.
Mm-hmm. It's, I've spent a lot of my scientific career engaged in scientific outreach, particularly to elementary school, high school, and university students. I've put 100 with my group, 140 odd, 150 something now, weather stations on schools in this region to try to provide curriculum resources to teachers to allow them to deliver, a science in manners that gives kids a hands-on experience. Just today, we had a school from St. Patrick's come through my laboratory in the morning, and so this is really important. But the problem is you have to also have an interest. So it's a struggle because, as you're becoming an adolescent, not everybody's thinking about what they'll do 30 years from now. They're worried about their image in the school that they're at. They're worried about so many things: the soccer game, the party on the weekend, the girlfriend, boyfriend, etc. And that's only normal. So I mean, I think it's important to discuss these issues in school. I think it's important. We have a crisis in democracy with youth not showing up at the polls. I have supported when Adrian Dix, the current leader, but soon to be former leader of the NDP, in the last election campaign argued that he would like to introduce the registration of voters at the age of 16 in schools. I think that's a great idea to actually get them engaged in our political systems then. Kids need to care because they do have to live the consequences of their decisions.
In the fifth report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, of which you were one of the authors, you're the first Nobel Prize winner I think we've had on the show.
Well, I mean, it's a team who won that, of course. It's the group, the whole, the organization, not any individual. So I like to just think I was part of a team. So.
But nobody else has yet even had a part of Nobel Prize, so this is really very nice. Anyway, the last report says, a large fragment of climate change is largely irreversible on human timescales unless net anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions were strongly negative over a sustained period. Now, if I work my way through that...
That's coming out of our chapter, too, the one I'm involved in.
That's right. But this means it would only be reversible if we were taking carbon out of the atmosphere, right?
Negative emissions.
Negative emissions is reducing carbon, not just stopping the growth of emissions. Yeah. Is that possible?
Yes. Well, the greatest example of negative emissions is trees, right? They absorb carbon. So you can imagine as we move forward all sorts of innovative technologies to be developed. Well, first off, the main removal mechanisms of carbon right now is the biosphere. The oceans also take it up through chemical processes as well as the biosphere in the ocean, and we also have weathering on very long time scales. This is when carbon dioxide mixes with rainwater, it falls on rocks and it can weather the rocks and carbonates end up in the ocean. That's very long time scale. That operates on many millions of years. Whereas there's also some ocean processes that operate on much longer time scales as well. But in order to speed that up, so what we've done to frame this thing, we've taken the carbon that was stored in the biosphere and converted to coal, et cetera, over tens of millions of years, and we're releasing it in 100. So now we got to say, okay, well, how are we going to get that back? Well, to get that back, you'd have to somehow sequester it. To do that, you'd have to develop scrubbing technologies. These are technologies that are able to actually capture carbon from the air and store it in some form, whether it be solid or some other form, and mix it into some deep saline aquifer. And those technologies exist. David Keith, now at Harvard, formerly University of Calgary, would argue that at something like $150 a ton of carbon, today we could actually sequester that economically from the atmosphere, from clean air. Perhaps it's even down by $100 a ton. So there is a possibility there. But there's other technologies, you might imagine some artificial photosynthesis of some form being eventually developed. You might imagine some clever ways of speeding up this million-year cycle chemical weathering. There might be some innovative ways that can be done. So there are some possibilities there. I think this is a challenge, but again, we'll only meet that challenge if we start to actually put a price on emissions, so that then it becomes, economically sensible to reduce those emissions.
So you come back to something like a carbon tax, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's carbon pricing, whether it be through a tax or through a cap and trade system. There has to be a cost on emissions for us to deal with this problem. Every economist out there will say, if you want to deal with this global warming problem, you have to get a hold of emissions, and to do that, you have to internalize the externalities. You have to pay the cost, the true cost of your behavior. That is to put a price on that emissions and let the market either set the price or have the price set externally through somebody, through a carbon tax.
Mm-hmm. Which you do have in British Columbia.
We do. We were at one point in British Columbia leaders in this environmental policy on global warming. When Campbell was here, he created not just one, but a potpourri, a portfolio of policies, one of which was a carbon tax. You can call it a carbon levy, but it wasn't just a fixed price. It sent a signal to the market for a 5-year period that the price was going to increase by $5 a year, so that business got a sense that there was some direction that the market was heading, and they could plan accordingly. There were other policies like the Clean Energy Act. There was tailpipe emissions. There was a carbon neutral government and landfill emissions policies. There was a slew of them that were put in place in BC.
And the impact has not been that the sky has fallen. So many businesses would say.
Well, not in that. In British Columbia, the evidence is very clear. Since the carbon tax was introduced, emissions have come down. Our economy has grown at a rate faster than the national average. Our emissions have dropped faster, much faster than the national average, and our population has increased. So per capita, it's even bigger. So no, the sky hasn't fallen. We've done well. In fact, we've done better than average as a direct consequence of the carbon pricing. And there was a research project headed out of the University of Ottawa that recently published that pointed this out.
So how do you go about making that kind of policy, that basket of policies, sexy for the world, or acceptable even to the world?
California gets it. BC used to get it. I think what we need to do is which is in some sense why I'm sitting in this office right here, is we're only going to deal with these issues if we as a society put in place the people who are willing to actually put these policies in place. We elect our leaders to make decisions, and we elect them to make the decisions in our best interest. Now, what people don't realize, of course, very often, maybe they do realize, is that there are a lot of lobby groups out there. There are lobby groups who come and meet MLAs, they come and meet ministers all the time, trying to push their agenda, push their projects. Well, we don't have, the individual person's lobby is only at the voting station. So once you get elected, there are people getting pushed by the forestry industry. They're getting pushed by oil and gas. They're being told, we can't do this, we have to do this, we must do this. And it's very influential, whereas, the clean tech sector, the innovative, forest sector, these are small cottage industries that are going great guns in some parts of the world, but they're hard to gain footage in North America because of entrenched vested interests. We just really need to engage ourselves in this democratic system and get people who are willing to say, you know what, I don't care if I don't get elected again. I'm not here to make politics a career. I've got a very successful career in science. It's, every year I'm out, it'll be less successful. But the reality is, if I decide to run again, if you ask me today, I'm enjoying this job so much that if the election were tomorrow, I would run. But who knows what I'll feel like in 3 years. If I took a substantive salary cut to come and do this. I took a cut in my pension, but it's not about money. For me, it's about making a difference and practicing what you preach. So I think, if more people actually got engaged who didn't care if they got elected again. I don't care if I ran again if I got elected. I'd fall back into a wonderful position. We need more people to do that because these people can make the right decisions as opposed to the decisions that are going to get them reelected in the years ahead.
So it comes down really to democratic reform, right?
I think so.
Some way or other, eh?
You look at the countries in the world where we, European countries, the Scandinavian countries, Germany, and you look at these leading nations, strong economies, they do have different processes for government. The fact that we have 85 seats here and that the Green Party with, 10% or 12% of the vote, let's call it 10% for say, we should have 10% of the seats, 8 seats. Well, we have 1 seat. And, I was fortunate, I had 41% of the vote in Oak Bay Gordon Head, but we came second. In the Lower Mainland, we had Adam Olsen with 1/3 of the vote. We had Jane Stirk with 30% of the vote. We had another candidate with 25% of the vote. We had significant votes concentrated in this region, but the first past the post system means that we have one MLA in all of British Columbia. And I think it would be healthy the Conservative Party of BC, 5% of the vote. That's not a lot of the vote, but that's a voice that needs to be represented in the legislature. They should have had something like 4 seats of our 85 seats, but we don't have that. So, and I do think it's a problem. And I think it's part of the reason why people don't vote, is they feel there's, it's just, if they get out, it's just this or that. I don't like this, I don't like that. If I vote for this, they're not going to get in, it's a waste anyway, so I'm not going to vote. I think we proved in Oak Bay Gordon Head that you don't have to think like that.
No. I'm also struck by the nonpartisan nature of what you had to say about the Liberal government and their policies in an earlier incarnation, because I can't remember when I've last heard somebody in politics praise an initiative taken by a government of which they weren't a member.
Well, I did that just today. Yesterday I put an open letter to the Premier, Christy Clark, about dilbit spills in the ocean, and the very opening sentence of this letter was, I applauded her government for being consistent and putting forward these 5 conditions and holding their guns on it. And you know what? I think one of the reasons why I got elected is that on the doorstep, I promised to do politics differently. I knew the Green Party was not going to form government. Who are we kidding? We weren't going to form government in the last election. We recognized that. I recognized that, but I thought it was important to tell the voters of Oak Bay Gordon Head that if I get elected, I will do politics differently. I will I will work with the government, and I exhibited that by voting with the government on the confidence motion associated with their budget. I did not just vote against like every other opposition member did in the official opposition. I voted with them because they just won on that budget. And it doesn't mean I'm going to sit there and say, great, this is great, this is great. I've been very critical of the government's plan on LNG from an economic perspective. I simply don't think the economics is there. I think there's been a lot of hype. And so I've been holding them accountable there, and I'm doing the same thing with the dilbit. And I think that's what the role of the opposition should be, is to hold the government accountable. It's not only just about trying to score media lines or quick quotes on gotcha stuff. Gotcha politics is what people are sick and tired of. They want to talk about substantive issues.
That's a very interesting comment, because what it suggests is that the population is ahead of the political process by some considerable distance.
I think they are. I think that I come back again to the second highest voter turnout in the province of British Columbia was Adam Olsen's in my colleague who's ran in Saanich North, 70%. He got it. He lost by 500 votes, but there was 500 votes or so, slightly separating first to third. 3 parties had a great race. What a great exhibition of democracy in action. When people came out to vote, they felt there was a choice. They were going back and forth. It was democracy in action. I think the population wants change, and I think they are ahead of it. I think, I do think they'd like something different from first past the post, whether it be preferential voting, whether it be proportional representation. I think there is an appetite for change.
And probably an appetite for more intelligent kind of ways of tackling some of these things, so it's not, the other guy's not always wrong, and right?
Yeah, I would hope so. Look, in science is all about conflict. We have the way, you have your work that you're doing, you're challenging the existing paradigm in science, you're defending it to your colleagues. We have PhD defenses, you give a lecture, you're getting quizzed and questioned on your assumptions in public. But at the end of the day, you gotta work with your colleagues. But politics, there's far too much animosity, jealousy, pettiness, and far too little, let's actually move this forward. Look at the US right now. I mean, for heaven's sake, the world's dominant superpower is shut down because of a handful of people are trying to refight a previous election. I mean, really? This is not intelligent politics. This is stupidity. And this is what dissuades the voter from getting engaged. And this is, when you want to see a collapse of a civilization, when you see what's happening in the US, you can only give your head a shake and start to think, this is downward spiral from there.
Mm. Yeah, and there does seem to be a whole element of living in fantasy about the way they do things at this moment.
It is. It's unbelievable. I cannot, and some people think it's a game. You hear the quotes, we're going to win this, we're going to win this. It's not a game. This is the government. This is putting in place the laws and regulations governing the livelihood of everybody in your country. It's not a game. It's very serious.
It's not being taken very seriously.
I don't think it is. I think it's a bit of a let's go get him, gotcha kind of stuff.
Yeah. Let me take you back to the science and then forward again to the politics. On the scientific side, as I was reading your work, I was thinking in keeping our cool, you seem to feel that the climate change denial forces were in full retreat, and they seem to have made a considerable comeback. But also, as I read through it, it's a very dire picture that you paint, and it's a picture that gets worse. We haven't seen a reversal of any kind in the graph that leads us to disaster, right? Is that?
Well, no. Since the book appeared in, I believe it was 2007. Since the new warmest year on record is 2010, of course, and the kind of denial sphere were in full retreat. They regrouped and came out on force during the Copenhagen Accord, and then they imploded again, and they're now trying to grasp onto anything again. So we just keep moving forward. I think when you look at their influence in large parts of the world, it's reducing. It's the same old names with the same old message. But my worry is we're getting the political sphere is throwing up their hands and says, it's too difficult to deal with. So just ignoring these kind of permanent skeptics, just throwing up their hands and saying, we can't deal with this, but I think we can.
Mm. So, but if I'm understanding what you've just said, you also see a kind of a steady growth of understanding of the issue, right, and the seriousness of the issue and the need for dealing with it, right?
I agree, yeah.
That which takes me to politics, because tell me about the decision that got you here. You had a very interesting, very full, and I would think very satisfying career that you didn't abandon, but you put on hold while you came off to do this, which many people would say was not a very satisfying career.
There's no doubt that I was very busy, but I still have a lab, but it's, I'm not there as often, and I'm not accepting as many students. Well, I've only accepted one in the last 2 years, or the last year and a half. So, and I probably will not accept any this year. So there's no question that I made a sacrifice on my career. I don't think I could go back and be at the level in science as I was. You can't, because you're at the front lines, and you step off that conveyor belt for a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, you can't be at the front again. It takes a long time to get back. So, but the reason why I did this is actually, there's a movie, it was demonstrated in a movie by Rob Stewart called Revolution. I don't know whether you're aware of it. And in that movie, he interviews me in Copenhagen in 2009. And I say the following, I say scientists have done their job. Now it's time for politicians to do theirs. I mean, I've given so many talks on climate science and from the education perspective. I could keep doing that, but in 2013 or 2012, I stood back and said, you know what? Here we are, and they're not doing their jobs. Should I get out there and talk about climate science again and talk about the importance of getting engaged in our political systems, the youth vote, etc., or should I stand forward and practice what I preach? And it was the latter reason that actually spurred me to do this. And I thought, there are many people out there who could actually continue to communicate the science, who could do the research. For example, I've trained lots of students in my lab, really bright students who are out there. They could, my position in terms of doing the science can be replaced. But how many scientists go into politics? None. This politics is filled with lawyers. And in law, the person with the best argument is the person who wins. In science, it's the person with the best evidence that actually wins the debate. And I think we need more of that.
Let me take you instantly to a little episode that I think occurred pretty early in your career as a politician, which was you took the decision to run and were instantly asked to step aside.
Yeah.
Tell me about that, and what does that tell us about politics?
I guess I was perceived as a little. I mean, there was a sense going into the sense of entitlement that the environment is owned by a particular party, and that splitting that vote off may be threatening to that party's success, and I was then perceived a little bit as threatening, and so I look back and think, well, this was all very silly, but there was, I could imagine on the one hand there are people who thought, great, this person's running, he'll steal votes from this side, on the other hand, thinking, great, terrible, this person's running, he's stealing our votes. The reality is, again, you just have to go and look at where the Green Party got votes. We got votes from the traditional Liberal voters, votes from the traditional NDP voters, but more importantly, we brought new people out to vote who've never voted before. So I think I heard on the doorstep concerns about vote splitting all the time. We're getting people emails, Facebook, Twitter, vote split. Greens are vote splitting. That is an objectionable argument, because it means, and that's an argument that actually annoys the voter. It's as if you're entitled to a vote. No, voters have a choice. You're not vote splitting. You earn a vote. And what I said in Oak Bay Gordon Head, my first thing I said on the night, I was so pleased to win, is that I said, we didn't split the vote. We were the vote. And I think that was a soundbite that actually obviously caught. But I think it should be true throughout the province. If we're going to live with the first past the post system, you have to earn the right to your vote and get out and do so. Don't just sit back on your laurels and say, vote for me because I'm not them, or vote for me because you can trust me. Give them something to vote for. And that's what we tried to do in Oak Bay Gordon Head, what we tried to do in Saanich North, and what we tried to do throughout the province with the Green Party. And I think we'll be more successful in other ridings as well next time.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? The vote splitting is premised on a first past the post system,
yes.
Right? I mean, if you didn't have that, if you did have proportional representation so that you voted for what you thought was right, and if there were enough people of the same opinion, it had some results. But actually, if you, in this system, if you don't vote for the winning party, there's a sense in which your perspective is discarded.
Right, and that's, so you feel that, exactly. So, but with that said, I agree that's one of the strongest reasons for proportional representation, which is one of the reasons why I'm so supportive of it. But with that said, you can still get out and vote. If you vote your I've always in my life voted for the conscience with the person who's running. I've never just picked a party and said, oh, that's the party that I want to vote for, click. And so I've voted in my life for every political party that's out there because of the person involved. And in fact, the first time I ever voted Green was for Elizabeth May, who was the person. I mean, who would not want to vote for Elizabeth May? She's so passionate, she's so articulate, she's been such a wonderful MP. That's a great example. I voted NDP over the years. I voted Liberal. I voted Conservative. I voted everything, both on the person and where I've lived at the time. So it's important to. I think people should always vote for the person, and because we are in a parliamentary democracy, and we are supposed to represent our constituents. And what better than to vote the person that you think is best going to represent your constituents? Look, here's something that a Green Party believe. If we were to magically form government in the next election, and let's suppose a hypothetical, let's suppose that I'm going to run again, let's suppose that I'm the leader, let's suppose that we win the next election, we can also suppose that pink elephants are going to be walking in the room, but let's suppose that. Then what we would do is I would actually form a cabinet that would involve people from other parties. Like, why not? Wouldn't that be a novel thing? Because we're there, I would want to find the people with the best expertise. I don't want somebody who's got expertise in selling used cars being the person on the forestry file. I wouldn't want somebody who's got expertise on forestry being the expertise on the small business file where you know, the used car deals would be important. You'd want to match expertise to areas and give some, and you'd want to use the talents you have there. And what's important about that is the executive of the province is very different. I mean, it's governed by a set of rules and regs that are quite different from the rest of the members in the legislature. So I don't see why. You don't have to have it so partisan. For me, it's not about power. For me, it's about good policy. And I think good policy is best done by having the best people in the room working together. That's the way science works, is you want to be successful in a science project, you find the best scientists in the area, you put them together in a proposal, and you put the proposal forward. It's the way to get good science done. It should be the way to get good politics done too.
Well, you know, I've actually lived through that experience in this country, because that's exactly the way cabinets have been formed in wartime, and I'm old enough to be, you know, to remember the wartime. But they did exactly that. They made a government of national unity, and then there was no question about some people saying we should be in the war and some people saying we shouldn't be in the war. Everybody said we're in the war, we got to do well in this war, and let's get the best people in the best posts.
Yeah, and I think that's the way it should be. It should be that not only in wartime, but in all time. We should be able to getting, you know, less partisanship and more getting on with the job. And I think you'd engage people then, our electorate, to actually come out to the polls more, so that you could actually get the best people for your riding elected, because you might have this dream and wish that they would actually be part of this executive. And then, you know, they might be able to actually do good working together. I mean, you know, people say you're naive, but look at the example you just raised in wartime Canada. It's not naivety, it's reality, and it has been.
No, and yes, you might very well come out and say, well, okay, the best person out of this riding is so-and-so, and the fact that that party is not likely to have the majority doesn't mean he can't be in the cabinet if it's, it's a wonderful idea.
Yeah, they have a certain oaths that they have to take. They're sworn to the crown, just like we all are, and they would have to work within the cabinet. The cabinet meets as a cabinet, and not as a caucus, as a cabinet, and you'd work together. You know, you'd have a different perspective. You might even have big arguments, but you know what? At the end of the day, you have to work together.
Well, in a sense, what you're saying is you'd have to do politics within the executive, as opposed to simply lining up the soldiers and counting them.
Well, sitting through the first legislative session, it's at times it's almost embarrassing to watch people just raw together in unison and raw together. You know, there are members in the legislature who said nothing, are totally and utterly ineffective, because they're just a vote. That's all they are. They're a vote. We have one more. They're not involved in decision making. They're just a vote. And I think that that's a shame. You know, sure, they can be engaged in caucus discussion, but you know, we shouldn't be told by, you know, let's suppose I'm an MLA from a region where there's a really big issue going on, but that issue might actually be not consistent with the issue from the majority of voters of that party. So you're not allowed to raise that issue in the House. Well, that's just not right. You know, we should raise the issue. We should have a roaring debate. We might have a civil, an educated debate, one where we're not just asking rhetorical questions and getting condescending answers, but we're actually really debating the issues. And you know, my dream is that we'd actually, at some point in British Columbia, do that. You know, we're the laughingstock in Canada. There was a talk at the UBCM where we were pointed out that British Columbia is the was it Andrew Nicofort? No, it was. Well, British Columbia was a laughingstock of politics in Canada, and in my speech, and everybody laughed. You know, and in my speech, I was addressing the UBCM. This is the municipal councillors and mayors across British Columbia, and I said, you know, when this is said, we all laugh, but frankly, we should be ashamed. We should be ashamed that we are the laughingstock in British Columbia of politics that's dysfunctional, and I think that we can be leaders nationally. And you know, I'll do my best to try to work with the government, work with the opposition, even when it's frustrating as anything, to try to move forward. And hopefully there'll be others down the road who'll join me in that.
Yeah, you're right. It always has been. British Columbia has always been the place where the inmates are running the asylum to some extent.
Yeah, I know.
Or perceived that way.
It's perceived that way. Yeah. I mean, there's lots of good people. There's lots of good people in all the parties. Unfortunately, the culture is one of conflict. It's a culture of conflict as opposed to a culture of getting the job done. And that's, you know, much as people made fun of the Premier for her comments about the culture in Victoria is sick, I think, I'm always trying to look for the good in a comment. I think what one could say is the culture of this legislator is one that needs to be fixed. It needs to be fixed so that we as members of the Legislative Assembly actually are in the business of making policy, the best policy for British Columbians, even when it's not, when it makes us having to face our conflicts too.
I guess the big sort of last question is well, two things. One of them was that you've commented when people say, what are the effects of global warming going to be, that you're surprised, your answer surprises them. Tell me what that answer is.
The two biggest issues of global warming, and I've been consistent with this from my perspective, are not the storm in Calgary today or the storm flood in New York. It's structural issues like biodiversity. It's quite clear evidence that substantive numbers of our species will become committed to extinction because they simply cannot adapt to the rate of change of climate as we're putting on now. And you're seeing that in species extinction speeding up. This is just going to get worse and worse. And that's been well documented and studied by the IPCC. And the second thing is political instability through geopolitical tensions associated with, number one, and mainly availability of water. And you start to see, the example that I like to use is, I did it in the book Keeping Our Cool, as I said, now let's suppose that you're a very wealthy person living next door to someone less wealthy, and you're consuming a lot, and you take your garbage and your waste, and you chuck it over the fence. And you do that every day, and you just chuck all your waste over the fence. And you're living the high life, chucking your waste over the fence. Well, that person over the fence has got a family in their house, and they're going like, oh, what's going on here? Where's this waste coming? Stop it. They might come over and say, stop this, or please, nicely, please stop it. And you just say, well, whatever, and you throw more over the waste. Well, at some point, they're going to have to either just roll over and die, or they might might just move away somewhere quietly, or they might get really annoyed at you and fight back. So you might respond to that by building up your, hiring security guards, etc. Or you might actually take a step back early on and say, you know what, perhaps I shouldn't be throwing that garbage over there. Maybe that garbage I should deal with myself so that we can live together. And, you'll have to deal with your garbage, I'll have to deal with my garbage, but I got a lot of it, and I'll learn how to deal with that, and I'll be able to teach you how to deal with your garbage, because I've had to deal with this. It's the same with the global warming issue, is that the consequences are going to be profoundly manifested upon the developing world, those closer to the equator, for example, who have the least ability to adapt. So, they can either roll over and die, or they can move somewhere, or they could fight back. And so a lot of, this can be, whether it be, as Gwyn Dyer pointed out, India versus Pakistan, tensions over water, or tensions in the Middle East over water, or tensions in sub-Saharan Africa over water, or what you do with, atolls or small island states as the sea levels continue to rise. There are problems. And so these are problems that you can either get ahead of or respond reactively to. And I think proactive dealing with the issue and avoiding the problems is a far better way to approach. Because it's not linear. It's not like, warming will create a linear response, and then if I warm twice as much, the response is twice as much. Biodiversity extinctions are final. They happen, they're gone, it's not linear. People and their interactions with their environment and each other is certainly not. Look, if I push you a little bit, you might move back. If I push you a little bit harder, you might move back further. If I push you really hard, you'll fall over. That's a nonlinear response. Your reaction is also highly nonlinear. If I push you and fall on the ground, I really don't know whether you're going to get up and say, oh, sorry, or whether you're going to get back and fight back. So as soon as you involve humans and pushing them, their reaction is nonlinear. So I think that getting ahead of this problem is actually important.
Let me take you back to the biodiversity just for a second, because I can imagine somebody saying, so a bunch of bugs are going extinct. Why does it matter?
Exactly. I mean, that's a very good question that society should discuss. Do we care about biodiversity? Well, one of the arguments might be, you know what, we don't know what's there for us. It might be, from a purely egocentric point of view, the cure for cancer might lie in some unknown flower in the Amazon jungle. That's just a simple, purely egocentric point of view. Others might take the more philosophical, faith-based point of view. Why have we been put on Earth? Are we here as stewards of the environment? That could be, you might view that man or humans are stewards of or caretakers of Earth. That could be your view. Or some might argue that, in fact, we've been put here to exploit Earth in any means and ways possible. So others might say that biodiversity is important for our economy. So it is a really important societal debate. My own reasons is I think that we are the Earth as a whole. There's only one planet. There's this diversity of life. As humans, I think we have a responsibility to nurture that as opposed to destroy it. And I frankly think that the more biodiversity, it's better both for the enlightenment of humans as well as for the potential success and stabilization of our future economies of tomorrow, both through things like medicine, through tourism, through forestry, etc.
And of course, we don't understand the relatedness of that whole web of life either.
We don't. And I think it's very easy to get rid of something. It's not easy to bring it back once it's gone. So I think you better be sure of what you're doing before you get rid of something.
Yeah. And finally, when citizens ask you what they should do, what do you tell them?
Get out and vote.
Dr. Andrew Weaver, scientist, activist, and politician. If you enjoyed this interview, you may want to look at our interview with James Hogan, the author of Climate Cover-Up, The Crusade to Deny Global Warming. Or you may want to look at our 2 interviews with Elizabeth May, the federal Green Party leader. For the Green Interview, I'm Silver Donald Cameron. See you next time.